Hello, my name is Catarina Barata and I'm here to present our work on how important is each dermoscopy image. Over the last few years, there's been a major breakthrough on the field of dermoscopy image analysis. It is undeniable that this has mainly been motivated by the steady increase in the number of publicly available datasets. Having access to larger datasets has made it possible for everyone to work on data-driven models like deep neural networks that can only be trained when a large amount of data is available. However, let's take a closer look at the available datasets. Something that is quite since the beginning is that the distribution of the classes is not even. So in the beginning, there were only nevi and melanoma samples, and as you can see here, the distribution is quite different. And as the number of datasets increased, as well as the number of classes, the same trends kept going. And nowadays, we have access to datasets where the distribution of the classes is very, very different. But why is class distribution a problem? So the first thing that happens is that if a neural network is trained with a very imbalanced dataset, it will probably learn a bias towards the most prevalent class, as shown here on this table, where, as you can see, the nevi class is the most predominant on the training set, and then when the network tries to generalize to a new dataset, the best performance is for the nevi class. And this poor generalization is something that happens especially for the less preponderant classes like actinic or dermatofibroma. What we conclude from this simple observation is that although deep neural networks like and need data to be properly trained, they also need this data to be balanced, otherwise they will have a hard time generalizing. However, imbalanced datasets are a reality on the dermoscopy field, and we need to be able to deal with them. But this is not the only problem that we face. So if we look at this table, this simple example, something that we notice is that not all of the classes are equally hard for the network to learn. So for example, for the basal cell carcinoma class, what we see is that although it has the half of number of samples of the melanoma or keratosis class, the performance is much better. So there is more than just in balancing on this dataset. Moreover, another question that we want to answer is if all of the samples that we are using to train the network are equally relevant or not. And all of this is important to train a proper model. And this is basically the challenge that we want to address with this work. So we want to be able to answer this question, how to make the most of the available data. And if you look at the literature, there are different strategies to address this. The first and most well-known by far is data augmentation, and this has been extensively used in the dermoscopy field as well. So you can either oversample the less preponderant classes, for example, using geometric transformations or some sort of generative models, or you can reduce the number of samples of the most represented classes. Another strategy is importance sampling, and this basically what it does is to alter the way the batch is constructed in each iteration to train the network. So, for example, some samples may be more selected than others during one epoch of the training. The last strategy, and this is the one that we will focus on, is called sample weighting. And here, basically, the idea is to weight differently the loss associated to each sample, and we'll see how it performs next. To understand how sample weighting works, let's first look at one training iteration of a neural network. So we have a batch of samples of different classes, here represented by the different colors that surround the images, and we pass this batch of samples through the network in a feed-forward way until the last layer, where we get a prediction for the class of each of these images. This prediction is then compared with the ground truth, and we are able to compute a loss for each sample, such that the average of all losses is then backpropagated to update the model parameters. The most common loss function is cross-entropy loss. However, by itself, cross-entropy is unable to deal, for example, with how easy or hard each sample is. So, to account for that, you have an alternative called focal loss, where you can use a modulating factor to decrease the importance of the easiest samples. But how does sample weighting come into play in all of this? So imagine that you extend the previous block diagram to include an extra model here, where we will compute an importance weight for each of these images on the batch, such that this importance weight will be multiplied by the loss function when you compute the average loss that you then propagate to update the model parameters. Let's take a closer look at the different weighting strategies in this paper. We have basically divided them into two groups. The first one is the group of the class balanced losses, where basically the idea is to account for the imbalance on the dataset. And on this group, the first type of weighting strategy that we investigated is the class balanced weighting strategy, where the weights are simply computed as the inverse of the frequency of a specific class on the training set. However, in recent years, it's becoming more and more apparent that this weighting strategy may be too strict and create a bias on the training. So, a couple of works, like the one that we investigate on this paper, have tried to find smoother versions for this weight, such as this one that is based on the effective number of samples, where basically the weight will be the inverse of the effective number of samples that is computed according to the dimensions of the training set. On the right side of this slide, you can see the output of each of these weighting strategies. So, for the first one, you can see that the most prevalent classes have lower weights than the less prevalent ones. For the second approach, the same thing happens. However, this approach is not as harsh as the previous one for the more represented classes. And this, we expect, will lead to slightly better results for this class. The other group of approaches is based on curriculum learning, where the idea is to, instead of manually defining the weights associated to each sample, automatically estimate them through an optimization problem, where the idea is to find the optimal weights that minimize this expression here. G is usually defined as the curriculum and can be computed using different approaches that range from simple norm expressions to more complex methods based on neural networks. In this work, we will investigate two simple methods. Both of that, as you can see here, are basically the opposite of one another. The first method is called self-paced learning, and the idea here is to define G as minus the L1 norm of the weights. The other method, which is the opposite, the symmetric basically, it's called online hard sample mining, and G is defined as plus the L1 norm. And what is the difference between these two methods? The difference between these two methods is amplified here on the right side. So for the self-paced learning method, basically the idea is to select the samples for which the loss is lower than the lambda, which is a hyperparameter that can be defined by the user. And this will mean that some samples will receive weight 1, while the others will receive weight 0. On the other hand, the online hard example mining does the opposite. So it will select the samples for which the loss is greater than lambda. And this can be seen as one of the methods, the self-paced learning one, selecting the easiest samples first, while the online hard example mining will select the hardest samples first. We have defined an experimental setup to evaluate the different weighting strategies. All of them were compared using 2DNN architectures and on different training validation splits of the ISIC 2018 datasets. The DNN architectures were combined with a CBAM attention model that allowed us to inspect the most relevant channel and spatial features for the classification in each case. To evaluate the performance, we have used a set of metrics, and I would like to highlight here that balanced accuracy for us is a recall across all classes. Let's look at the performance of the baselines defined by the cross-entropy loss and the focal loss for the hierarchical classifier, and I invite you to check the performance for the other model on the paper. As you can see here, the performances are very similar, with focal loss achieving slightly lower results than the other. When we add the class balancing weighting strategy, something that we notice right away is that the values for the balanced accuracy increase significantly. This is expected as both of these methods try to improve the performance of the network on the less represented classes. However, something that we also noted on our experiments is that these approaches also create a bias towards the more represented classes by significantly reducing the performance of the network on this type of lesions. When we add the curriculum learning methods, what we observe is that both self-paced learning and online hard example mining show very different performances. So self-paced learning achieves significantly worse performances than all of the other methods, suggesting that it's not a good idea to make the network learn first the easiest examples. On the other hand, the online hard example mining achieved very good scores, not as good as the class balancing metrics for the balanced accuracy, but the trade-off across all metrics is better. We took a closer look at the attention maps that result from CBAM. And something that we notice is that for lesions that consistently achieve good performances, these maps do not change that much depending whether or not we are using class weighting schemes. However, for more challenging classes like melanoma or actinic, we notice that the maps are very different, which suggests that the weighting schemes somehow influence the features learned by the model and force them to be more discriminative. This brings me to the end of my presentation, where we have compared different weighting strategies, and we have assessed that all of them influence the performance of a deep neural network. Not all of the methods improve the scores, and when some of them do, they also induce a bias on the model, which is undesirable. We also observe that the features learned by the neural networks change according to the learning strategy, becoming more discriminative for some classes. In our opinion, online hard example mining achieves the best overall performance and further study is required. Thank you for your attention, and I invite you to go and check the code for our paper.